Hello and welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. The date today is March 18th, 2016, and we're in part two of our interview with Darron Smith, author, Dr. Darron Smith, author of When Race, Religion, and Sport Collide, Black Athletes at BYU and Beyond. Now, this is an amazing book. You should buy it. You should read it. I loved it. We spent the first hour talking about systematic racism theory, about racial frames. We talked about the history race in the United States, but also of people of color in athletics. It was a great episode. I really recommend that you go back and listen to that first hour. It provides a lot of really good context for what we're talking about now. And so what I want to do for this episode, and by the way, it's worth mentioning that this is pretty much the 10-year anniversary of my episode with Darron called Black and Mormon, the Darron Smith Story, which was released on March 30th, 2006. So it's been 10 years since I interviewed Dr. Darron Smith. He's now at the University of Tennessee as faculty there?
Yeah, I teach there. I teach in the PA physician assistant program there.
Yeah. And we're just really honored to have you back, Darron, or Dr. Smith. What would you like me to call you?
Call me Darron, John.
Okay. So
everybody else calls me.
Everyone else calls you what?
Yeah, it's Dr. Smith. No, I'm just kidding.
Dr. Smith.
I'm joking.
We'll call each other. You call me Dr. DeLynn, I'll call you Dr. Smith.
Call me exactly.
No, John and Darren's better. All right. So we touched on, we're going to talk about BYU athletics now, and we touched on this last episode, but let's start with a bit of a bigger frame. You mentioned last episode that you find college athletics, and particularly maybe football and basketball, as being highly exploitative to people of color. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so.
Talk a little bit about I think you talked about them not getting fairly compensated for their work, that they're generating billions of dollars in revenue and seeing very little from it. But let's just start by talking about the exploitative nature of college athletics, especially for people of color.
Well, I think there's this assumption that these young men get these free scholarships and then
a free education, right?
And a free education, and that's their compensation for play. But they also get a meager stipend, which is barely enough for them to survive on. So occasionally you hear stories about an athlete selling a jersey or an athlete getting money that they're not supposed to be getting, because these young men are coming from, some of them are coming from the bottom, if you will. Not all of them, but certainly a large portion of these young men are coming from situations that, that they want to rise above that and use their bodies to do so. So athletics takes from them, it steals their labor power that they willingly give, but they give nothing in return. Because you say, well, they get a free education, but many of them don't finish. They don't finish their education, never take advantage of it. And the second part is that, John, many of them are not even prepared to be at the D1 level to even begin with. So you've got this sort of mismatch. Like these young men are set up to fail before they even get there. And I think most coaches and athletic directors and others who are involved in recruiting realize that these young men are to be used and then turned out, and then used and turned out, et cetera, because there's an ample supply of young folks who are willing to play, D1, high in the D1 high revenue sports of football and men's basketball. So the system is exploited in that it takes and it gives very little in return. And when I say little in return, in terms of compensation, there was a movement a year or two ago to pay athletes, and that didn't go anywhere. There was some traction, but then it stopped, unfortunately. There was also another lawsuit. I think Ed O'Bannon filed a lawsuit trying to get the trade agreements, his numbers, the numbers that the players were that sell like hotcakes. to even get those, get a percentage of those, I think that's still in flux too. So I think that as long as these young men are getting so little in return, looking, particularly considering where they come from, right? When the NCAA is making so much money off of them and not giving them very little in return, it's exploitative. Okay.
Yeah, I want to be careful here because we don't want to say that all athletes have the same experience.
No.
But I tutored athletes at BYU when I was an undergraduate there, and I've had some exposure to the athletics at Utah State University in my graduate work. And what I can say is, both for athletes of color and white athletes, sometimes there seems to be this sort of system where there are certain majors that are identified that aren't maybe particularly rigorous. There are teachers that are identified where their courses are super easy, or they're known to be very friendly to the athlete. And in some ways you can maybe take a major like physical education or health sciences or recreational sciences, and there's sort of, I don't want to say it's a sham of an education that sometimes these athletes can kind of engage in, but it certainly doesn't always seem to stack up to the same type of rigor. And I don't want that claim to sort of mean that means that people of color aren't fully capable and qualified for doing well in higher education. So in some ways, I don't want to perpetuate bad stereotypes, but at the same time, I think I just want to dig a little bit deeper on this perception that they're getting a great education, because sometimes it's almost like just a very low caliber of education that some of these athletes, both black and white, seem to be receiving. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. And I would say that that's certainly the case. Now, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination at all. I mean, I think that athletic coordinators, do kind of steer players into certain degrees that are easier, because these young men, most of them, are just not prepared for the rigors of college. They came from very poor schools to begin with. They probably used their athletic abilities to get them from point A to point B. So they never really got the basics. So when they get to college, they just are completely out in left field. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them are. So in that sense, we failed. We failed these young folks. And then by the time they get to college, we just simply reinforce it. Because, and what I'm saying is that, and for your audience, the vast majority of these players don't graduate from college. They don't finish college. For those that do finish college, a small percentage of them will go into the professional ranks. A very small, less than 1%. Okay, it's a super small percentage of them will go. So they have to have something to do, some way to make money, to survive. And oftentimes they leave without a degree. I think I say in the book, they leave with a concussed mind and a bruised body. And that's all they have to show for their time at wherever they went.
Because again, and I'll even say I've heard of like scandals taking place where like either other students at the university or people outside will actually take exams for these athletes. They'll log on and pretend they're them on these online courses. And there's various ways to make sure that even for the legitimate courses they have, that they don't have to learn and achieve. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to, I think the system enables them. It enables them to get by with just their brawn. Yeah. So we're not doing these people, these folks a disservice by allowing them to leave the institution with nothing, And so, again, I want to press upon this with your listeners is that college athletics is an industry, just like the professional ranks is an industry, just like education is an industry. And within that industry, it's about commodity. It's about the bottom line. It's about revenue. So they have to find some way to make money. It just so happens that the biggest sports, the biggest revenue generators are football and men's basketball. And it just so happens that over 60% of them are people of color. In some sports, in some places, it's even more than 60%. So they are the workhorse of the teams, but they get nothing in return.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So the myth, and did you say less than half actually graduate with degrees?
Yes. Yes.
That's
some
horrible.
schools do better. Some schools do better than others, but in general, no.
Less than half. That's awful.
It's terrible. And BYU has a very low GSR rate as well. So GSR score is something that Tides does to sort of evaluate whether or not a school is producing graduates, student graduates, athletes who graduate. BYU had a very, very low score, which basically means all they do is they bring them in, churn them out, bring them in, churn them out, because most of these players don't. I mean, there's another layer to that with BYU. I guess we'll get to that.
We'll get into that, yeah.
But it's an exploitative system where, sadly, blacks feel that that's one of the only ways that they, one of the only ways of upward mobility they have is by playing athletics. But I'm not saying that's bad. I don't want to be, because I love athletics myself. I'm not saying it's bad, but when it's the only industry, right? When there's all these other ones out here, and that's the only one, we got to be asking questions. Why? Why is that?
Yeah. Yeah. So they often don't get a legitimate education. They often don't finish their education. They don't get compensated well for what they're doing. And then I heard you say that they leave with physical. They often leave with physical injuries,
physical scars, or
mental injuries, cognitive injuries that are so significant that those sometimes those injuries can last a lifetime. Is that right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And I would say the same exposure that NFL players have to CTE, so do college players as well. There's always that risk. So when I say leave with a bruised body and a concussed mind, I'm speaking literally. So there's very little for these players to do and translate that. And the reason why I'm saying this is because when I've interviewed some of them to see what they're doing post-football, they're struggling. And so and some of them are so polarized and so fearful about what happened to BYU, it was very hard to get them to talk about it. So, but at any rate, so we can do better.
Yeah.
And I think we can do better.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I historically have loved college football and I've loved college basketball. And this, along with the movie Concussion with Will Smith, is just really, it makes it hard for me to enjoy those sports now, because I wonder if I'm supporting industries that are less than ethical.
Yeah. Well, some are. The problem is that it's not widespread. Some are better. Some institutions are doing better than others in terms of their GSR scores, graduating athletes, putting them out. In fact, well, I don't know if we want to go into that now, but I can tell you right now that the two schools to the north of Provo, the two major schools are doing much better than BYU in terms of producing graduates.
University of Utah and Utah State University.
That's correct.
Go Aggies. Woo! Okay, so let's talk about you writing this book. Did you interview a bunch of former athletes to kind of gather some data for this book?
Yeah.
Was that part of the process?
I'm losing you, John. Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Was that part of your process to interview athletes to get a sense for their stories? Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to try to triangulate this so I can get some, just some their personal experiences. So a colleague of mine, he and I did a story back in 2011 in Deadspin, where we looked at the disparities of honor code violations between BYU. And so I took that theme and went further with it, right? And so the group of people that we interviewed then, for that article, I extended that and interviewed a whole different group of people, and asked them similar questions about their experiences when they played, at BYU. And it was very fascinating because I wanted to see what their thoughts were. If my hypothesis was consistent with their experiences, I'm happy to report that it was.
So talk about this these kids grow up in Dallas, or they grow up in Houston, or they grow up in Los Angeles, or they grow up in Florida, wherever they grow up, right? Talk about what you know of the experience of sort of a black male athlete graduates from high school, gets recruited by BYU. Talk about what that experience is like, what makes them want to consider it, what that recruiting experience is like. And we all think, oh, the honor code, we all know it, we all read it, we all sign it. But just start with what it's like to be a black high school graduate recruited by BYU.
Exciting that someone is interested, in you. So very exciting, and so I think and things are moving really, really fast, and you have to make decisions quickly, and so for a young person who gets the opportunity to go to a D1 school, it's a very exciting time. And BYU, part of their sales pitch to these young people is the wholesome nature of the school. That one of the ways that the parents can be reassured is that their child won't be, into any shenanigans, like maybe at the University of Florida or, Florida A&M or some institution like that, or even Vanderbilt for that matter. No offense to anyone. But at any rate, so that's the hope. And so BYU, the coaches, the recruiting coaches, when they go and they sell BYU, that's part of their spiel to the parents. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So oftentimes it does when they're going after players who are not necessarily, or who I wouldn't say necessarily like a University of Oregon level player, if you will, or maybe an Alabama player, caliber player, if you will, but a good player nonetheless. They're going after these sorts of folks, generally from California and Texas were one of the big areas they recruited from, but they're recruiting from all over the place. So a parent hearing that, my child gets to go to BYU, I mean, that's just wow. Just the fact that my child can go to college is like, wow, that's heavy. And then the parent, and then most of the coaches at BYU when they go and do their recruiting trips, John, they have the missionary, vibe about them. They know how to sell. They're very trained in that art, and they're very convincing. And I'm not saying it's part of a nefarious plot, but I'm just saying that it's not necessarily full disclosure or full transparency about what they will encounter at the institution. Now, these young men, for your audience, these young men typically grow up in what we would term as urban communities, right? So I take the black out of the urban, right? So folks, you say black communities, you tend to racialize that. It's black community, or even urban has that sting to it. But urban generally means segregated community, right? Where these young men go to schools with people who look like them or Latino, right? They probably haven't had the greatest academic experiences. They probably come from a single parent home or a two parent home where both parents are there, but they're struggling to make ends meet. Some of these players that I've spoken to had parents who were incarcerated or parents who had been killed. So these were people who were looking for an opportunity and were hoping that sports would propel them into something better than what they had, at the hood or wherever they came out of. So, and the parents are extremely optimistic to have I want to impress upon your audience, John, to have an institution like BYU or Stanford or USC interested in any of your children is a major honor, particularly for working class black parents who never expected their child to even go to college, for that matter.
Do you think that these kids in Dallas or Los Angeles or wherever, do you think most of them have ever heard of BYU? And have they heard of the Mormon Church? And if they have, do they know anything about the church? And then specifically, do they know about the church's racist past? Or I can imagine a bunch of kids in Dallas who've never heard of BYU or Mormons, really. Talk about if you have any sense for their understanding of the church and BYU.
Absolutely. Most of the ones that I spoke to, most of the players that I spoke to, save but one or two, had no idea about the Mormon Church, had no idea about Mormons. It was all new to them. And they certainly didn't have an idea, they certainly didn't have any concept of just how conservative Utah County would be for them if they chose to attend there. And they got an education like they never expected. So these young men were they never heard of they never really heard of the curse. I asked them have you ever heard of this stuff? And some of them had said, no, we didn't know anything about that. We heard about it when we got there, but before we were getting there, no, we never heard anything about it. We had always heard it was a good school. It was very wholesome. Nothing really goes on there. And that's why our parents were interested in having us go there, so we can be like watched after, if you will. So, but they had no concept of it.
Okay. I'm sure in the recruiting trips, you hear about recruiting trips at other universities where kids are taken to parties, maybe women are provided to them, maybe, they're just shown a really good time. Do you get a sense for how those recruiting trips are for BYU football, for example? And is there a way for them to sort of communicate, there's the honor code, and the standards are high at the university, but we have a way to have fun, and they're reassured that they'll be able to find people like them and to be able to have a good time in spite of the honor code. Do you have any sense about that?
Yeah. I mean, some of the players. So before the players make their trips to, their recruiting trip to BYU, and they spend time at BYU, kind of look at the facilities and see everything, and so on, and so they make an intelligent decision. They tell them about the honor code. Sometimes they velvet glove it. Sometimes. Sorry about that person's walking.
That's all right. That's all right.
So, I can strangle her later. No, it's just my daughter. But at any rate, what I was saying is that some coaches velvet glove it, right?
Okay.
Oh yeah, we got this thing called the honor code, but you'll be okay. And some will say give them the more hard press. It depends on the coach and who they're recruiting and how bad they want that athlete. So once they do get to BYU and they do make that trip, some of the players that I interviewed said they did have parties. They had some of the players would take them to these parties and get to know people and sort of so they can see that this is a cool place. It's not just a bunch of squares, in Provo, but there's actually a happening scene there. So sometimes that happens. And sometimes it did. It completely depends on the character of the coaching staff. Like, for instance, when Lavelle was there was more of that type of, wine and dining athletes. But after the Bronco got there, a lot of that stopped. So it depends on the character of the coach. So, but at any rate, there were some orgies and things they went down to. So, I mean, like any other school, these are young people with raging hormones.
So you talk in your book quite a bit about the honor code and why it's problematic for these black athletes. What's wrong with the honor code? If you're telling us they know about it beforehand, they sign it, everything's above board. You're saying that some coaches maybe, velvet glove it a bit. But what are your fundamental concerns with the honor code as it's experienced by these athletes?
That's a great question. And, the fundamental problem is that it's not just a document, John. It's an extension of theology. It's an extension of Mormon theology. So it was just a freestanding document with a bunch of words that anybody could adhere to. That's one thing. Like any other universal honor code at any other school. But for BYU, and most of your audience members who attended BYU can testify to this, it's an extension of the gospel. And these players don't know anything about that. Okay, most of them were sexually active before they came to BYU. They probably will continue to do that when they get to BYU. Some of them engaged in, other things that they would abhor, people in Provo, but they did those things in their particular setting, and they transported those things with them to Provo.
Are you talking drugs and alcohol?
Drugs and alcohol, partying, sex, drugs and rock and roll, that kind of thing. So that partying scene. These are young people who a lot of them, that's their MO, that's their lifestyle. So to put them in an environment where the honor code is not just a freestanding document, but rather it is actually an extension of theology, is hugely problematic because it's setting them up for failure. already from the get-go. It's already creating a two-tier system. Just by the fact, even though they're velvet gloving it, and the problem with the velvet gloving it is that it's not just a velvet glove, it's actually gospel. So it's really to me, it's really deceptive in the sense that the coaches don't really say, well, this is what we believe. And we believe it so strongly that we actually require our students to sign this document, and if you want to come here, you have to be willing to abide by these principles while you're here, and if you can, great. If you can't, then we understand, et cetera. So, but even those that say I can abide by it, I can do that, and they sign on it, and they get here, then it's a whole nother ball game because they have, man, I spoke to Ronnie Jenkins. Is it okay if I talk about Ronnie?
Please,
Ronnie?
Please.
Okay.
As many stories as you can tell. This is Mormon stories.
Okay, so that's a good point. So Ronnie was one of the top running backs at BYU several years ago. And when he got into some trouble and was kicked out of BYU, he was a NFL prospect player, a marquee player. I spoke to him about what went on when he got discharged. So Ronnie said that I asked him about girls, because before you came there, did anybody tell you about dating? And he said, well, it was dating would be difficult there because there's no black people there, So that's sort of what he went on. The sort of assumption he went on that there's going to be a lot of dates with people who look like me. But he gets here, right? And I said, well, did you date anybody when you first got to BYU? He says, well, no one was interested in me. I had nobody that was feeling me. He said, but when I started scoring touchdowns and started running, that ball back, I had to fight him off with a stick ball bat. I said, so what does that mean, fight him off with a, and he said, well, basically he said I had to pick a delivery. I could take, So the girls were certainly willing to accommodate a non-member. And so that wasn't a problem, and not just Ronnie, but other players as well who had similar encounters as well, and had who dated.
And you're talking white girls, obviously.
Yes.
Probably believing members of the church.
Yes, and some of them, head over heels in love with these guys, and then when it went further, when they tried to go further with, of course, the parents shut it down very quickly.
You mean being sexually active, or
wanting to get married?
Or wanting to get married, yeah. Being
sexually active, I think all of those things. And so when they went and tried to ask for the hand of marriage, of course, that was a big no-no. So and so that was a lot of these players are so funny to talk to them about, how they experience race, how they felt. Because they said that before we went to BYU, some of them said before we went to BYU, we knew we were black and we knew we were racialized, but when we got to Provo, we really felt we were racial. We really felt it there, the isolation there, right? And the presumption that, we're sort of dumb jocks, you're dumb jocks, and that sort of stereotype that goes along with it, or frame, if you will, because these folks take classes and take majors that have very little, economic, very little ability to translate into some money once they finish their degrees. So it's really difficult for them, I think. And so to get kicked out of BYU, and Ronnie said when he got kicked out of BYU, he floated around a little bit. He went to the NFL, but he said that experience haunted him, the entire time that they kicked him out. It followed him around like a dark cloud, he said, and he wasn't the only one to say that as well. So I had several other people as well. Because it mars their reputation when they try to go to some other institution. And to make it worse, sometimes BYU didn't release their school records, making it even more difficult for them to move on with their lives. So just mean-spirited stuff that really shouldn't happen. These young people already have it rough as it is. So it's like throwing salt in the wound. And over stupid stuff, generally. Drug, sex, and rock and roll, typically.
Yeah, that's interesting because, if a black athlete or a white athlete is, let's just say, expelled from a team in another state or university, Well, it's usually for some really serious thing, right?
Yeah.
Like robbery or assault or
Right.
serious drug use or whatever. So if you're at BYU and you get kicked off the team for having sex, you still carry that reputation of being kicked off a team. It just so happens that what you did is something that at every other university is sort of
It's
just
normal.
absolutely
Normalized.
normal, right?
It's normalized, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. See, you can't. Is that you're asking young people to stop doing the things that they did before, which is very difficult for them to do. I'm not saying they can't do it, but it's a long shot. And so I think that's why you have this revolving door there.
What do you mean by a revolving door? What does that mean?
Well, they'll maybe get 1 or 2 years out of these players because they'll get up there and they'll find these, they'll get themselves into some chastity related troubles, and they'll be kicked out. And that's been most of the experiences there have either been sex, or they've been alcohol related, or they've been weed related. There has been some robberies and some assaults mixed into there, but generally it's sex. The big one is sex.
Yeah. So you're saying maybe they don't fully understand what they're getting into, and even if they do, it's an unrealistic expectation for many of them. And I would say even for the ones that don't get caught, you're telling me that it's often the white co-eds that are having sex with these black athletes, and even if they don't get caught, it sounds like they're having to learn to lie, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
If you had to guess, like what percentage of let's just say black athletes at BYU are sexually active, do you even have a sense for what that might be? Do you think it's most?
Probably, if they're non-Mormon.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
but generally, I would suspect that non-Mormons would be more sexually active than Mormons, but that's not necessarily true because of Brandon.
Yeah.
I mean, Brandon was knocking the bottom out of 2 people, at the same time. So, it depends on the person.
Right.
But listen, if your audience only knew how hard it is to be a black male in Provo, it's like on the one hand, you're damned, right? But on the other hand, these girls are coming at you like, literally, you are a chick magnet. I don't mean to be disparaging to your audience, but literally, these young men have to fight these. I mean, they're young, chiseled bodies. They're in shape. They're out there on the field. They're sort of heroes, if you will. They're celebrities. It's the same way in Provo as it would be in any other place when it comes to athletes.
Yeah. So it teaches them to lie and hide, or it sets them up for likely failure, which leads to this revolving door sort of dynamic. Yeah. You also talk in the book about, let's just say, unfair application of the honor code. Is that right?
Yeah.
Talk about that for a bit.
Well, I mean, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the theological twist to it. The way in which the honor code is not just a freestanding document in and of itself. It's not just a document like you would sign at Stanford or CSU, Colorado State, for instance. It's a part of the theology. So that's part of the deception, is that this is not just a document, player X or player Y. This is part of our religious code. It's just enshrined in this particular, prose for people can pledge their faithfulness to the church, but essentially it's gospel principles. Here's what we believe. And they're not told that. They're just said, sign this document and abstain from this, that, and the other, and you'll be good to go. Right. And then I met, on the other side of that equation, I met players and spoke to players, John, who kept everything on the down low the entire time they were there. So nobody ever found out, and they just kept it on the down low. Right. Some players were much more out there, and those were the ones that got, like, for instance, Brandon was a magnet. Brandon was a bullseye.
Let's talk about Brandon for a second. Tell his story.
Well, Brandon's interesting to me because Brandon is an adoptee, and one of my areas of research is transracial adoption.
This is Brandon Davies, right?
Brandon Davies was a player.
Basketball player.
Basketball player at BYU in 2011.
During the Jimmer Fredette kind of era.
Jimmer Fredette era. So Brandon was like, big, tall man, gifted athlete. But he got into some trouble. He violated the honor code when he rumor got out that I think he went and told someone that he had premarital sex with this young lady.
It's because his girlfriend got pregnant, right?
Right. And that got out. I mean, but it was two different stories running at once. There was one of the first story was the young lady who was down at Arizona State. So, and then later came out that he had another young lady in Provo who had gotten pregnant. By the way, I spoke to her. During I was interviewing, and she spoke to me a little bit. And she said that the baby that she had I'm jumping the gun, so I'll get to that. But at any rate, so Brandon was hitting two women at once. Just so happens he got this one pregnant. So
and Brandon was raised by white parents.
He was raised by a white single parent mom in Provo. And so he grew up a member of the church.
He grew up LDS. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. He attended Provo High School, so he was a big, tall guy, so he stood out. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure he was exoticized because he was so tall and he stood out. He was a black guy. He was a young man, a black man in with white sensibilities because he's raised in a white community. So that's what he knows. But after a while, I'm not saying that after a while, one of the athletes had mentioned that they tried to abide by the principles of what the church had said that they should be doing there. But he said, man, after a while, these girls coming at you, I couldn't break. I had to break. Just got waves of them coming. So he said, eventually
it's almost unrealistic, isn't it? If they're sexually active before, if they're worshipped by the culture, if the girls are coming at them hard, if they're in their late teens and early 20s, man, they're going to be having sex. That's just the way it's going to be.
Well, you tell me. You're a psychologist. How hard is it to give that up if that's all you've ever done, and you come out here and all of a sudden you're supposed to be celibate? How hard would that be?
I think it'd be almost impossible. And it's hard because they could go to another university usually, and they wouldn't have to deal with this, but they come here, and sometimes it can ruin their career, right?
It has ruined a lot of careers. It sure has. Yes. Because to get kicked out of a school means you're damaged goods. So another school may not be as interested in having you, particularly if they can't get your academic record or they find out that you violated the honor code. Most schools don't know that the honor code at BYU is theology. It's not just a freestanding, I want to keep saying that, it's not just a freestanding document, but yet it represents the canon of the church, which is a disadvantage to anybody who's non-Mormon going there.
And it just is part of your point there just that it's not appropriate to be pushing our theology on other people's life?
Yes, exactly. If these young men come there, take them as they are. Take them as they are, or don't recruit them. Recognize that you can't make them become Mormons by having them, not do the things that they were doing at home. Either you take them as they are, or don't bother recruiting. And I think that's exactly where the direction they're going.
Do you get a sense that white athletes are treated differently than black athletes as it relates to the honor code at BYU?
Sure.
Talk about that.
Well, John, it would be foolish to assume that black athletes are the only ones having sex. Right?
Can I just tell you, when I was a tutor at BYU of athletes, one of the guys that I tutored lived with his girlfriend in their apartment. He had a cover of an apartment that he was supposed to have with his roommates, and he was white, and he lived with his girlfriend, and that was at BYU in the early 90s. Anyway, that's anecdotal.
Well, that's my point. My point is that that's happening. But in the event that a man, a player who's a member of the church runs afoul of the honor code and has premarital sex, they have more avenues to deal with the repercussions of that. They have more shock absorption, if you will. They have the church to fall back upon. They got their home wards to fall back upon, the university wards to fall back upon. They got their families to fall back upon. They have a cushion, whereas these players don't have any of that. They're kind of on their own. So so we don't know much about the white players who are having sex who reported it, but it wasn't reported in the media because we don't see that anymore. But I would imagine the numbers are fairly high. I wouldn't be surprised because it's a university, and I was called to be in the high council there, so I had a chance to be involved in several church courts, and most of them that I was involved in had to do with sex, somebody having sex with somebody.
Sure.
So, and these are white male students.
Right. Would how sometimes BYU culture encourages students to tell on other students? Do you think a sexually active black athlete would be told on at a higher rate than maybe a sexually active white student athlete? Do you have a sense for that?
I would say 100% guaranteed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because remember, because encoded on that body are these frames. One of them is the sexual predator frame. That's pasted upon the body of a chiseled young black athlete at BYU. So yeah, definitely. And because everybody's going to know you. If you transgress, the honor code, everybody's going to know who you are. So you can't hide. So most of the players, a fair amount of them had went to Vegas or went to Salt Lake to find romance.
Okay, so some of them avoided dating.
Yeah, altogether.
They'd keep those relationships outside.
Yeah.
I have to think also, obviously we have a history of condemning interracial, marriage and interracial relationships. I have to think that if some BYU student discovers that a black athlete is sleeping with a white woman, let's just say, I have to think that our culture would trigger in them some sort of negative response that would make them more likely to tell on a black athlete than a white athlete. Is that just something about our interracial prejudices that could come into play there?
Well, I would say certainly. I mean, I think that if you look at there's studies that sort of help sort of reinforce that. I mentioned a few of them in here. One about the jerseys. Black jerseys tend to draw more fouls, that was interesting, even in hockey, right? Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, So when you ask,
tell that study. Talk about that.
Yeah, study. it was the NHL did a study where they looked at dark jerseys, dark jerseys compared to light jerseys. When I say dark, I mean black jerseys.
Yeah.
And those that were consistently called for fouls were those players who were wearing black jerseys. Right, those players that played at their teams were wearing black jerseys. They had more fouls called. Now they duplicated that same study in the NBA, and sure enough, players who were wearing black clothing during their games had more fouls called on them than those that didn't.
And do black athletes get called for fouls more than white athletes? Didn't you say that as well?
Yes. They do, and also I would also say that black football players, quarterbacks in particular, right, tend to get pummeled more often than white quarterbacks, right? And also the expectations that are placed upon the black quarterback is very different than those expectations placed upon white quarterbacks. So it's all racialized. We talk about race as being, not central to this narrative. It's hugely central to the narrative because it was central to the narrative in 1619. And that has not stopped. We have to get out of this idea that we're not a racist society. We are highly racialized. Among other things, we're also xenophobic and Islamophobic. So there's a lot of things that we are in this country. We got to get away from these ideological shackles that hold us down, to keep us from being the people who we know. We're still an experiment, and so far we're not doing terribly well when it comes to social relations. So we need to start to tear these barriers down and replace them with sensible measures that are equal and that have equal outcomes, or that can produce equal outcomes for those students who are the least of them. And if we don't do that, we're going to continue to have problems with race into the year, into years, into the next century.
So towards the end of the book, you sort of make recommendations for changes at BYU as it relates to the honor code and black athletes. What are the recommendations that you would offer BYU if they were to say, Darron, tell us how to fix this problem? What would you say?
I wish they would, but they'll never do that.
They haven't done that yet.
No, I doubt they will. But I would hope that they would allow more faculty of color. This is all pipe dreams. This is all wishful thinking.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen, but we hope it will, but it won't. But at any rate, and if it does, it'll be Mormon people who come in who are not that great, who are just, who are going to do the same thing that they're expected to do. So no diversity in ideology at all. But at any rate, the point is this.
Pipe dream. What's your pipe dream?
The pipe dream is this: more faculty of color in leadership roles, right? Who look like the players they're recruiting, i.e., Pacific Islanders, black players, shrinking numbers of black players. Now we're seeing more half-steeds, more biracial children, children of members of the church now who've grown up, who are going to BYU. Interesting now. So more biracial kids.
Do you mean leadership in the athletic department?
Yeah. I mean in the president's office and in the athletic office as well.
Okay.
So both. So you need faculty, you need coaching staff, you need academic coordinators who look like the people they're serving. Because again, it goes back to the very first discussion we had, John. You said, do people get tired of seeing, or just all they ever see is this? They see themselves they never see themselves as doctors, lawyers, and blah blah blah. It's the same exact argument. Folks have to see people widely represented in order for them to aspire to be more than just an athlete. You have to give people a vision of what they can be. So they have to change that. The second thing I think is to have a mentoring program in the community where you have members of the church who, if you can find them, look like those players who are on the team, who are not squares, who can relate to these young men and women, but who can relate to them and provide them with some guidance of how to navigate Provo, how to survive Provo. So
what if the players aren't Mormon? They don't want Mormon mentors, right?
Well, that's all they have in Provo. But maybe we can go to Salt Lake and get some mentorship up in Salt Lake that are non-Mormons. And we probably could. We could probably have a relationship with, and I don't know why they don't have a relationship with Calvary Baptist Church. Calvary Baptist Church in Salt Lake would probably be more than willing to help facilitate a mentoring program for black athletes at BYU. So, I mean, just thinking out of the box, so providing these young men with some community where they can feel a part of, where they'll want to stay and they'll want to be productive in the environment. And so those two things, I mean, I think would be a start, a huge start. And I think that when these young men come to school, they need to, if they don't complete their degrees, BYU need to have some kind of program in place where they can come back and complete their degrees for free of charge, whether it's done online or whether it's done in residence. These young men shouldn't have to pay for their education once they've completed their playing time, their collegiate careers. They ought to be guaranteed that.
I once heard that athletes typically are not given multi-year sort of scholarships or contracts, that really it's year to year. So if an athlete gets injured in year one or year two, they're released. It's not like they get to continue and just go on and study for years 3 and 4 and finish their degree. If they get injured in a way where they're perceived as not being useful to the team anymore, they're released. Is that your understanding?
It depends. I mean, most of the time they honor their scholarships, even if they do get injured. They honor those scholarships.
Okay.
So, but there's only one school that I know that's ever done this program, and I loved it. The U. I remember when Chris Hill, who's the athletic director at the U, he asked me when I was working up there, when I was an undergraduate, to go find athletes who had finished playing, their careers who wanted to come back to the U and finish their degrees, and that the U would pay for that. So I went out and started looking for athletes, and I found one of my very good friends now, whose name is Ralph McKinney, who played for the U, but he went back and finished his degree in economics. And so stuff like that, where you have universities who are putting money back into these young men who played for them, so they can at least have, finish with a degree. Now that helps their GSR scores, that they're able to get these players to finish their degrees and move on and be productive citizens. BYU has a responsibility to do that, right? Why is BYU, right, who claims to be the pinnacle of sanctity, right, allowing its rivals, right, the University of Utah and Utah State, to outperform their athletes, to outperform them in the classroom and the gridiron? I don't understand that. Why can't they be models, right, and provide similar, advances in these young men's lives than what they're currently doing? It seems like BYU just literally churns and burns. Get them, boom, use them up, spit them out, get them, spit them out, and just, and occasionally you'll find a Curtis Brown in the bunch who converts, or Kalen Hall who converts, right, and then goes on and lives a storied Mormon, existence. Very rarely, but that's very rare. More often than not, these young men leave and go on to finish their degrees elsewhere, or don't finish at all.
What about the honor code itself? What would you make changes in terms of requiring these athletes to sign and live by the honor code? Well,
yes. I mean, I think that they need to recognize that the way it's written now is not to the benefit of these athletes who are coming in. And I know they have an ombudsman there at BYU. His job, or a chaplain. His job is to sort of act as a liaison between the athlete and the administration. But the problem is that he's LDS, so he can't. It's really unfair. He can't really relate to the non-LDS players, so that's really unfair. So they have to do a better job at meeting athletes where they are if they continue to recruit athletes who are not members of the church. And it's my understanding that those numbers have dwindled. They've cut those numbers down. And what's happening now is the people of color that you do see playing BYU football generally are second, generation Mormons, who've grown up.
Okay, but still, you would say, don't make them live the honor code. It's an extension of our theology. It's setting them up to failure. It's setting them up to be sort of looked down upon. It affects their careers negatively. It requires them often to be terminated early from their career, and in just so many different ways. It's unfair.
It's a liability.
It's a liability for them, right? And of course, the university is going to have a hard time letting the athletes live a double standard, right? So ultimately, how do we scale this impasse? And I simply say in the book, if you're not going to do the things that need to be done, then don't bring these young men here. Don't bring them. Just
don't bring them there. And I would actually warn players of color, African American players, be careful, vet them carefully, because if you go up there and you meet Becky and you fall in love with Becky and y'all start doing y'all's thing, and then they find out you out. So you got to recognize that.
And publicly shamed and embarrassed.
Well, they used to do that. They don't do that. Well, they claim they don't do that anymore. They don't blast them on. So before Bronco got there, they would blast all this on the news, so everybody would know what was going on, and these guys would walk around with an A on their chest.
Yeah. So
they don't do that anymore, which is actually, I actually agree with that. But even still, they're setting these players up for failure because they don't tell them, or they don't understand that this is not just an honor code. It's theology, and you can't really teach them to be Mormon by having them sign this document. It doesn't work like that.
In Brandon's case, the news got out. I mean, anytime they release a player, even if they don't talk about why, everyone's left to sort of guess and fill in the blanks as to why a player got released. So I guess you're saying they don't say why the player was released,
right,
but they're still releasing players, right?
Well, yes, but they don't blast them all in the media the way they used to. I think Brandon was the last because of Brandon. That was the last time they changed that right after Brandon's experiences. So
yeah, because poor kid, right?
He walked around. He would every time people saw him, they saw him as a sex crazed black man, right? That's how he was characterized. So he got to carry that around on his back everywhere he went, and he's from the community. He is the community.
Yeah.
So, man, and I think right now, he was playing in the NBA. He's no longer playing in the NBA. I think he's overseas playing overseas basketball now. So I wish him luck. I tried to interview him, for the book, but he wasn't trying to hear what I had to say. It was actually a positive, a supportive stance, recognizing what he's gone through as a player and as a young black man growing up in Provo, probably very naive. So
he didn't want anything with the book. No.
The young lady who had the baby by him. Okay, so here's the story about Brandon's love child. So the young baby was given up for adoption by someone in the lady's ward in California, and the child's being raised there. And the mother of Brandon's child has but still gets to find out what's happening with the child. Brandon signed over his parental rights to the family, so he's not in the child's life at all. So that's the outcome. So it turned out to be it's a really cute kid too. So, but at any rate, there you have it.
Okay. All right. So to summarize, BYU, do the right thing and change your policies to make them more friendly to black athletes. And if you don't, then stop recruiting them, right?
Stop recruiting them.
Yeah.
And not just BYU, but other institutions as well. Quit using these players up and spitting them out. And BYU has an added burden of throwing that religious piece on top of it, making it even more difficult for players to be successful and productive in such a very austere, religiously strict environment.
Yeah.
So
and pay them better, you're saying?
And pay them.
Pay the athletes better.
Sure.
Okay, so this has been a fabulous second hour talking about BYU and athletics. I've really loved it. I want to end maybe on two things, and I think that my first question may be really short. We did talk about the LDS Church really briefly last time, and honestly, I struggle with this question as an excommunicated Mormon because to me, it doesn't really feel relevant to my life anymore. But is there anything the church can do beyond what we've talked about to become a less racist and a more inclusive organization? We've talked about having the leadership reflect the racial composition of the members. Let's just say there's some believing Mormons out there that are saying, I don't want to be part of a racist church. I want to make a difference. What have you even thought about what can be done, what people can do to try and be a part of the solution within the church? And then we'll talk about just as American citizens after.
Well, within the church, they can petition. They can do the same. White folks are great at mobilizing, man. when white folks want to get something done, y'all mobilize. Like in the LGBT community or the Mormon feminist movement, all that. I mean, white folks want to get stuff done, it happens. when black folks who are members of the church want to get something done, it's like crickets. Okay, nothing ever gets done. So, and I like I said before, I don't expect anything to get done because the population, the demographic is all wrong. Well, we're talking about racial justice. You're talking about racial justice mainly the Republicans. Most Republicans don't even get a sense of what that means. I'm not saying the Democrats do either, but especially Republicans. So I think you have this mismatch. But I think that the church needs to apologize, man. I mean, you can't move forward without an apology. You have to say, it's not enough to say, yeah, this man pinned on Brigham Young, but you got to take some ownership and say, institutionally, we allowed it to happen. We have ownership in it, and we apologize to our black brothers and sisters for the hurt, the pain, the suffering that we've caused institution. They need to go there Until they go there, they'll always be disingenuous, man. Disingenuous.
So apologize, make your leadership representative of the people that
do better
being led. Okay, those are the
don't
main
call
things.
Tokens. Don't call. I mean, if you're gonna call people of color, don't call tokens. Get people of color in a committee to help you pick people who might more represent their interests. But that's not going to happen. That's called a democracy, and the churches aren't democracies.
Yeah.
So I don't ever see anything happening, John.
What do they do with the Book of Mormon? They're kind of stuck with the Book of Mormon, which is kind of racist, right?
Kinda. Yeah, highly racist. But again, the church is no apologies. They have no apologies for any of that. They have no apologies for any of it. So, for me, for one, I can't mess with that.
It's kind of amazing that so many believing Mormons can read that book and just kind of be okay with it. Like for me now, the Book of Mormon in and of itself makes it impossible to be an active member in good standing, because the book says that God turns people's skin dark when they're wicked. It's what the book says. And that, you would think that'd be just a automatic non-starter for at least 3/4 of the people. But most of them are just like, oh, well, yeah, that's what it says.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's just not relevant to their life. So it doesn't,
right.
It's unfortunate it happened, and people make excuses. Oh, brother, you'll be white in the next life. It'll be okay.
Or they say that the curse wasn't the dark skin. The curse was something else. It was the mark or the mark of the curse. I mean, there's all sorts of weird logic that they use to excuse the Book of Mormon, but I don't think the Book of Mormon is excusable in that way.
Well, I mean, it is what it is. It is what it is. Now, it's a racist text. It is what it is. I think the Book of Abraham employs racist ideology as it explains the story of the creation, and why certain groups were withheld the priesthood. If it, and that's even if the damn thing is truthful to begin with. So these particular theologies are racialized, and they position blacks in a very, evolutionarily speaking, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. And black folks have to come to terms with that. For those that practice their faith, they have to come to terms with their own marginalization in a church that has a long history of that.
What? And I'm not calling you to sort of judge another, but what would you say to a black brother or sister that finds a way to stay an active believing member? I mean, on the one hand, I think we all want to say people's beliefs are sacred. You believe and act how you want to. We respect that. But maybe there'd be another conversation you'd want to have too if they were willing. What would that conversation look like?
You're party to your own marginalization. You're participating in your own marginalization by attending, because the church is not going to change their position and standing on the position of blacks. They're not going to change that. If you're looking for that, they're not going to change it.
But if they say that the church has changed, they've stopped being racist, they've given them the priesthood, the church has changed. What do you mean they're not going to change?
Well, maybe they stopped being rhetorically racist, but those behaviors are ingrained. They're ingrained. They're still there. And the evidence of that is that individuals within the church all across the nation, or even in Africa, still teach, or still utilize the racist folklore that's supposed to be now defunct, but they still employ that stuff. So until the church comes out and says, we owe this group an apology, and I want to reiterate again, this is BS. Don't teach this. This will continually be a problem.
How do you feel about the church expanding in Africa? Like, let's be honest, the church is shrinking in Western Europe. It's shrinking in Japan and Korea. It's actually shrinking in the United States. Mm-hmm. If it weren't for the very high birth rate, it would be shrinking in the United States as well. And inactivity rates all over the globe in the developed world are super high. But do you have any thoughts or feelings around how Africa's been opened up and Africa's being targeted? And a lot of our growth in the 21st century comes from Black Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. How does that make you feel, or what do you think about that?
Well, again, African's a whole different culture, whole different cultural group. So, but I think that the history of Africa speaks to it being ripe for Mormon missionary service in the region. Nigeria, Ghana, these areas are, for all intents and purposes, white identified African countries, African nations. They love white folks. They love white religions that come in there, Nigeria and Ghana. So they believe in the myth of white Jesus. And so the church has had inroads there because these people, unlike American blacks, who have always seen white leaders and have had white leaders impose their particular will upon them, Black Africa has had black leaders, so they don't impose their will upon them. So they haven't had the same experiences with whites in the way in which blacks have had with whites in this country, the direct exploitation. So I think there's a whole different experience there. But Africans are joining the church and they believe it's true. You know, they believe it's absolutely true. I mean, I say, so Africa is ripe for not only the Mormon church, but also other evangelical churches have been very successful in proselytizing amongst Nigerians and Ghanaians. So the Mormons are just one particular sect. So but most churches have found, you know, great receptivity in those two countries because they're already Christianized, if you will. They already speak English, you know, so it's a match made in heaven. And also they don't possess the same racialized, you know, the same experiences with race that American blacks have experienced or other European blacks.
Would you say it's fundamentally dishonest for a Mormon missionary to baptize a person of color without explaining to them the history of our racist doctrines?
Yes. I do believe that. I think it's absolutely dishonest.
Do you think that's going on? Do you think that happens?
Oh yeah, of course. It happened when I was a missionary. I can't imagine that it's still not happening. It hasn't been that long. Things don't change that fast. So, and I know that when missionaries are out in the field, people are asking them, "Hey, tell me about your church and its racist policy." Oh, back when blacks could, and they start spitting off. Well, there was a time when blacks were thought to be less than. Their skins were dark, but as they got, you know, more righteous, you know, their skins turned as white as snow. I mean, they launch into that bull, right? And in fact, I remember when I was missionary, man, I said that to two black college students at the University of it was Western Michigan when I served my mission. That brother looked at me like I was crazy, man. He was like, "You hear this guy?" He goes, "Dude, your church, man, is racist, dude." And that's kind of like, I was like, what? I was so like, what? Racist? I didn't know what I was talking about. So it took me some time to sort of wrap my brain around that. You know what I'm saying? So it's the ultimate betrayal, John. Yeah. I feel betrayed.
Yeah.
Very betrayed. And I'm saying that as a one-time, you know, practicing member, you know, if I feel betrayed and I actually know the culture, I can only imagine with those that don't know the culture, you know, what they experience, you know, so.
Yeah. All right. Last question. And this is like,
all right, brother.
This is, first of all, I want to do a shout out to a couple good things going on. There's a podcast that some of my friends are leading. It's, Misha, we talked about her. I think it's Misha McGriggs. Gina Colvin and Lindsay Hansen Park, they have a podcast, I believe, called Color. Oh my gosh, I had it on my mind and now I'm going to give it its proper respect.
Look it up real quick.
The color of, oh my gosh, this is super embarrassing. Color of Heaven. And I figured that out before I looked it up. It's just a brain bleep. So Color of Heaven podcast, Gina Colvin, Misha McGriggs, and Lindsay Hansen Parker, they're exploring the history of race in the church. Please go check it out. It's brilliant work. Also, there's a blog, FemWalk, it's called, Feminist Mormon Women of Color, and lot of really great stuff happening there as well. So I just wanted to call out at least a couple organizations that I think are working really hard within the faith to try and make progress and inroads. The last question, and maybe we need to have a whole nother episode about this. We certainly do, but let's just say for citizens of the United States, of middle and upper class white people who think they're not racist, but they are, and they think that they're allies to people of color, but they really have no idea what they're even talking about. What is there anything that we can do to try and be a part of the solution to what's going on in America, to try and move us from, people can vote, but there's still all these areas of systematic institutional disparity, education, healthcare, incarceration, the workplace, the academy, the police treatment. What can basic American white folk do to try and be part of the solution?
So short of systemic change, right? Wholesale systemic change, whites who are in positions of leadership can reverse the role, right? They can reverse the trend of mistreatment. They can reverse the trend by hiring more people of color, by giving people a fair opportunity. And when they get into the job, allow them an opportunity to flourish, right? Because oftentimes you can get a job, but when you get a job, you experience bitter discrimination from within. So recognize that. So individuals can do things by unlearning the racisms that speak them. As I said before, it's institutionalized in who we marry, where we go to school, the churches we attend are examples of how race is institutionalized in the partners we select. Even though there's been 10% of all marriages now are interracial marriage. That's still very low. Still very, very, very low. So most 80% of marriages are same race marriages. So people select their same spouses. So if you want to end racism, you start there. You got to mix things up a little bit, right? People got to look a little different. Otherwise, it'll continue to be the way it is. So that's one way. White allies. Well, to be a real white ally means you have to commit racial suicide. So basically what I mean by that is you have to leave Utah. You have to move into communities that are more diverse, which are hard to find. Very hard to find, because generally speaking, America is very segregated.
Still.
White, black, brown, nobody really lives. Now in the bright communities, typically black people like me follow middle class white people around. So white people live out here. I live in Germantown. So out here in Germantown, you got mostly white people, and you have bright people. So you have Indians, East Indians, African Americans that live in, it's very few, but the vast majority of blacks live in Memphis, the city of Memphis, which is where poverty, blight, and so on exists in most of the areas there. So you've got this very polarized, segregated cities, and you have Utah that's extremely white. So in order to change that dynamic, it can't just be a rhetorical exercise. It has to be rooted in action and rooted in you have to vote with your feet, essentially. So you have to be so today, as a white person, you'll look different today than you did yesterday, because you've allowed yourself as a white person to be transformed by my experience as much as I've been transformed by yours. And part of that begins with listening, right? Because just because you don't experience racism as a white person doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? And so I can spill my guts with data and this and that and the other and still not convince the non-believer, right? That racism is a significant problem in this country, and we're seeing it sort of ramp up over the last the last 8 years. If you haven't seen race play out in the last 8 years since Barack Obama has been president, you've been living in a cave. I mean, we've gotten more racially polarized because of who Barack Obama is and what he signifies, what he represents, what he embodies as a black man. And a lot of white Americans are highly uncomfortable with the presence of a black man in the White House. They have always been, particularly with a liberal in the White House, someone like Barack Obama. They're even equally as scared of potentially having a woman in the White House, for that matter. So we're scared of the wrong things, first and foremost. And so white people need to commit racial suicide, live in more diverse communities to the extent they exist, try to be better stewards by hiring diversity, learn about diversity. You don't know shit about diversity because you don't live in a body live in a body like mine and experience what I experienced. You have white privilege. So part of the white people that I know who are really doing something live in black communities. They don't live around white people. They live in black communities. They have black spouses, right? These are white people that I know. They're extremely committed to, racial justice. And for them, racial justice is a complete transformation. You can't be a white person and be committed to racial justice in the ways that these two people have demonstrated. They've completely uprooted and moved into communities that most white Americans would never do. Mm-hmm. So it takes that kind of discipline and that kind of effort, and shy of a revolution, which is not going to happen because most whites would rather push the button and allow other people to have access to what they've had access to for 400 years. So it's also a very ethnocentric type of a process too.
So I hear you saying listen. In addition to all the things you said, I heard you say listen, become aware of your own privilege and what privilege means, become articulate about that. Would you, and I don't mean to pick on anybody, but would you say that religion, just in general, is holding us back in some ways from more progress in this area?
Well, yeah, because I think, the most segregated day of the week is Sunday, the noon hour. So religion is still very much, religious institutions, John, reflect society at large. So if society is segregated, religious institutions will be segregated. So they aid to it. They enable it as well. So, again, religion is also a racialized event. Less than 10% of 10% of religious worshipers attend interracial congregation. That's very low.
That means 90% are racially segregated.
Going to racially segregated.
It's either black church or white church, Hispanic church.
Right. Exactly right. Yes.
Asian
Never
church.
the two shall meet. Never the two. So we have to. So
it's
that's
awful. It's terrible.
It's terrible.
It is terrible.
It's really bad, and we've lived with, and we're okay with that as a society. And then we wonder why there's crime. We wonder why there's blight. We wonder why people are struggling, right? And people need help. You wonder why. We got to be more charitable. More understanding, and recognize that our history has a lot to do with our future. Our current situation and our future has a lot to do with our past. And until we recognize it as society, and white people, y'all the one that did it. Y'all's ancestors did it. Mine didn't do it. Yours did it. Right? I mean, mine were forced here. Right? Yours came voluntarily in most cases, and were able to build up wealth and have opportunities at wealth generating businesses and so on and so forth. My ancestors didn't have that. They were denied that clear up into 1969 when the last Civil Rights Act was signed. So it's only been 50 years, and people expect, shit to be equal when it's only been 50. It's been 50 years, and that's not considering bitter discrimination that continues to exist. So it's going to take another 400 years until everybody's mixed up, enough to where there's no more. I'm gonna borrow my brothers and sisters' words, ites among us, if you will.
All right, Darron Smith. The book is Where Race, Religion, and Sport Collide: Black Athletes at BYU and Beyond. The author is Dr. Darron T. Smith, a repeat participant in Mormon Stories podcast. Darron, it's so good for me to see you alive and kicking.
You look good, buddy.
Likewise, and it's been so fun to have you on. I would like to continue this conversation, so I would like to ask you if maybe you'd consider coming back. Sure. If we kind of get into this a little bit more, we'd love to have you back. Would you consider it?
Sure, anytime.
All right, anything you want to ask our listeners before we sign off?
No, I gave John a flyer. I'm assuming he'll post it somewhere where you all can see. If you want to buy the book, I would recommend you use that flyer because it's a hardback book, and the publisher's trying to make money off this. So I'm trying to save you money. So please get the flyer and order the book. I'd be happy to sign any of them for you. If you want to send them to me, I'll be happy to sign it for you as well. So thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, Darron Smith, you take care.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on Mormon Stories. Listeners, please go up to mormonstories.org and post your comments or feedback. Give Darron lots of praise and no criticism.
Thank you.
If you want, go to Amazon and rate this book and give it good ratings.
Yeah.
Please tell people about it. And if you have thoughts or feedback, we want to hear it. And then separate from the book, all of you who financially support Mormon Stories, just know that your donations are what makes Mormon Stories possible. So if you're able and willing and you want to keep Mormon Stories alive, please consider donating to that as well. But again, Dr. Smith, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you back here again soon on Mormon Stories.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Take care, brother.
Take care.
Okay.